So one of the things Jairus, when he asked me to share, he said, try to think of maybe one of your favorite passages or something along those lines. So we're going to be looking at one of my favorite characters in the Bible. And the question I want us to begin to think about is, what impresses God? If you think about it, we often are trying to impress people, right? Who are you trying to impress? We've got employees that are trying to impress their employers because they want the promotion. We've got kids that always are trying to impress their parents, right? They're always like, look at what I can do. And hopefully they succeed. But they're always like, look at what I can do. We're always trying to impress people. We got dating situations where we got, trying to impress guys, trying to impress girls, girls trying to impress guys. I haven't dated in a really long time. So I just Googled what not to do on a date and what to do on a date. The top thing for what not to do on a date fit right in with this. And it says, don't show off. That's what girls said to guys, don't show off. What do guys typically do? They show off. I actually remember when I met Corey at freshman orientation in college. I didn't take long, freshman orientation classes didn't even start. I stood there and I was talking to Corey. I met her and we just stood there on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, this was like a freshman island party. And here were all of the guys, and what they were doing to impress all the girls, they were actually eating real goldfish. Yeah, not the crackers they got in the back. Yeah, the real ones. And they were like down on them, like, look at me, ha! And like a month later, I'm dating Corey and they were single. So showing off doesn't usually work. We had a new hire as well at work just a few months ago that just went to training, came back. He wanted to show us, we had this plane we don't normally get that landed, and he's like, I know how to work that plane. And he's like, I know, and so I'm going to go do it. And he turned around to walk out the door, and he totally missed the door and ran right into the wall. Again, trying to impress, usually it blows up in our face. So I want to look this morning a little bit at what impresses God. To look at in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be focusing mainly in Judges chapter 6 through 8, but just to look here, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it says, faith is the confidence that we have hope for what will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. If we move forward to verse 6, it says, and it is impossible to please God without faith. To please and to impress God. It is impossible to please him without faith. As we move through that chapter, it goes through and gives all these examples. But as it wraps up in verse 32, it says it would take too long to recount all the stories of faith in the Bible. It says to recount the stories of Gideon, Barak, Samson, and it goes on. Now I want to focus on Gideon. See, Gideon's listed as a person of great faith, a person who impressed God. Gideon lived in a time between when the Israelites, if you remember, the Israelites were taken to Egypt and they were freed, and Joshua came and they conquered their land, but yet they didn't have a king yet. During this time, Israel kind of followed God for a while. God was a big deal in their lives. And then they would decide, he's not really a big deal anymore. And the world kind of went away and didn't really pay attention to God, and then they'd fall victim to some kind of outside oppression. And when we look here at Judges, in this case, the people that were oppressing Israel were the Midianites. The Midianites were these great people that just loved to travel around, to be in the area. They were from the area where today would be like Saudi Arabia. And they didn't really have a home. They just, they called them nomads. They just kind of, like I said, went area to area. But what they were famous for is they'd let you do all the hard work and then steal it. In other words, they let all the Israelites, in this case, they would grow their crops, and then year after year, they'd come down and they'd steal all their food. At the time we pick it up here in Judges chapter 6, this has been going on for 7 years. People were poor. People were falling apart. I mean, imagine you had no money to sell crops. You hardly had food to feed your family for 7 years. I mean, we're having some rough corn looking out there just from 1 year of not the greatest amount of rain. Imagine 7 years of no crops. We look here. I want to first start, look at verse 13. Because I want to look at Gideon. If faith impresses God, I want to ask ourselves, what kind of faith do we have? I think that as we look through this whole passage, we see that Gideon had a detached faith, and he had to move to an engaged faith. So the question I want us to think about as we walk through this morning is, where are we? Do we have a detached faith or an engaged faith? We look at Gideon. Why do I say that he had a detached faith? In verse 13, Gideon replied, and we'll get back to this whole conversation, but it says, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles that our ancestors told us about?" Where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? If you notice, it isn't what are the miracles that we have seen. Often in the Bible, when something would happen, they go back and say, "I remember what God has done." And they hold on and say, "God has done this in our lives, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And then it goes on to the great victories of what God had done for the people, including the person speaking. But no, instead, this is what our ancestors had said. You see, Gideon had a detached faith because he's telling a story that he's not in. He's telling a story that his ancestors have said. There's no faith with God himself. It's just a story he has heard. Detached is faith without action. It's talking about God, but really not ever doing anything about it. Again, Gideon had to move from this detached faith where he was sitting there, but he really wasn't part of the story. He was in the room, but he wasn't engaged in part of the story of God himself. Engaged is when it becomes our story. It's when we start following through. As we read this passage, we're going to see that Gideon moves from "this is a story I've heard" to becoming part of the story himself, to it, like we looked in Hebrews, he becomes a person of an example of faith for everyone forever. How did he do that? See, Gideon first had to engage God. God spoke to him, and he had this conversation with God. And if we continue in chapter 6, we see that Gideon ends up offering him an offering. In verse 17, it says, "If you're truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it's really the Lord speaking to me, and don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you." And so he goes home and he makes us this offering, and he places this goat as an offering to God. Again, this is someone that's had no crops, no economic income for 7 years. His family, his friends were like, "What are you doing? You don't have money for a goat, and you're offering this to who? To God?" Again, the world had moved away from God. He was the least of their concerns at this point. People thought he was out of his mind. But see, Gideon provided a faith offering that he could not afford to impress the one that he could not ignore. See, he provided an offering he couldn't afford at all in order to impress, in order to give honor to the one he couldn't ignore. The angel of the Lord was sitting right before him, and he's having this conversation, and he's like, "I have to follow through with this." He was moving. He was taking action by placing an offering to God. Because it's so easy, like I said, to just slide into that detached faith where we're sitting in this room, but we're not part of the story. So Gideon is working on getting re-engaged, to getting engaged with God. And see, now that's when the fun begins. So let's look a little bit here in the story, since I'm kind of giving a little bit of where Gideon is at. See, in chapter 6, it starts off here with, like I said, talking about the Midianites and their oppression of Israel. And the Israel's crying out for help. And then the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon. And the important thing is, what is Gideon doing here? It says that he is threshing wheat in a winepress. And some of us are thinking, okay, that seems weird, but what is that? I want you to imagine, instead of, like, he was harvesting his wheat, but instead of harvesting the wheat out where most people would, where there's wind that's going to help get the chaff away from the wheat, instead of harvesting it like you would normally see, he was down in a wine press where nobody could see him. He was hidden because he didn't want the Midianites to know he was harvesting. And that way he could hopefully keep his harvest. So he's doing it for self-preservation. But here's a guy that was hiding. And God comes to him, the angel of God comes to him and says, mighty hero, or some of your translations might say warrior. Mighty hero or warrior, the Lord is with you. And the first thing, if we're going to move from detached to engaged, I want us to look at is to remember your identity. See, God calls Gideon here, and he calls him mighty warrior, a guy that most of us would view as a coward. He's hiding. He's hiding, doing his normal everyday task as a farmer, but he's not even doing his task out in the open. He's hiding from the enemy. Notice that God calls us not by who we are, but who we'll be in the future. God calls us not by who we are, but who we'll be in the future. You see, he's calling Gideon a hero because he will be a hero. He's not yet, but God sees his identity in the future, and God sees that in us. It's kind of weird to think about, but think about how your name changes for women. Usually they change their name when they get married. Not always, but often they'll change their last name to their husband. If someone showed up now and started calling my daughter by a different last name, I'd be like, what are you doing? That's not her name. But yet God knows who she will be in the future. I have no idea what her new name will be many, many years down the road. I have no idea, but God does. And that would be really freaky if God showed up and started calling her by a different name. Yet God knows her identity. And he knew who Gideon was and who Gideon would become. So I want you to think about who is God calling you? Who is God calling you? Because God knows, like I said, not what you are today, not whatever you're feeling today, not whatever obstacles you're going through today, but God knows who you are and who you will become. As we continue through, like I said, this is a farmer hiding. God knew who Gideon would be. See, the other thing as a reminder is, look, Gideon, like I said, was a farmer hiding out. We often think when God calls us to do something, whether it's to serve in our church, whether it's to do something in our community, to step up and meet some need, we think, oh, I can't do it because I'm just whatever. I'm just one person, or I'm just this. Gideon didn't say, I'm just a farmer. See, we got to remind ourselves that we don't have to be someone special to do something special. Or you could say that everyone's special in God's eyes. But you don't have to be someone special in the world. You don't have to be someone that has this special title, this special thing, in order to do something special and extraordinary. We're all special, like I said, because God created us. He created us as unique individuals with unique gifts, unique strengths. Zig Ziglar says, you're the only person who can use your ability. How did Gideon see himself? Gideon struggles with this. As he has this conversation, and he says, Gideon, go. And Gideon's like, hold on here. In verse 15, he says, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the world, in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. He's saying, look, I'm in the least important tribe, and I'm in the least important family of that tribe. You can't get more unimportant than me. How can I be the one that leads people in order to take on these people? No one's going to follow me. I'm viewed as the least. And God reminds him, I will be with you, mighty warrior. I will be with you, hero. I will be with you. See, we have to be able to see ourselves as God sees us. And sometimes we're blind. Sometimes it's hard to see what's in front of us, let alone see who God wants us to be in the future when we can't see it. So Gideon had to see himself, and he had to keep being reminded. He had to hear his new name over and over. You're a hero. You're mighty. You're strong. And then he took action, and he went through and gave that offering. Because, see, he was being shown that being available to God was more important than who he was in his family. It was more important than birth order. It was more important than any of that. Was him being able to allow God to use him. The story goes on. Like I said, Gideon makes the offering. He pleases God. He does that. And then he's kind of like, okay, God, is this really what you're asking me to do, or do I have a bad taco? You ever kind of have that question? Is God really speaking to me, or is this like just some kind of bad food I ate? Then I'm thinking I'm hearing things here. So he does some tests. If you've ever heard laying out a fleece, this is where it comes from. He lays out the fleece and it's like, make the ground around it wet, keep it dry. God does it. And then he's like, well, just in case, can we do it one more time and do the opposite, make the fleece wet and the ground dry? So he does it both ways, and God gives him the assurance that, look, this is what I am calling you to do. He asks a sign, God confirms it. As a side note, I don't know if you heard, I said a few of the questions, but one of the things I love about this passage is Gideon is full of questions. Sometimes we're told that asking questions isn't good in church. If you read through this, it's like almost every other sentence from Gideon is, God, I have one more question. God, how about this? And he's in the hall of faith. It's okay to ask questions. God wants us to dig deeper. So, like I said, Gideon says, okay, God, you've called me to do this. So Gideon goes out, he makes the proclamation, he's going to gather up all these people to go on and take on this enemy, the Midianites. So we need to remember who we are and our identity in God. The second thing is we need to remember our influence. Remember your influence. Gideon had to move from a place of feeling powerless to a place where he knew he had influence of others. I want you to think about it. Have you ever felt powerless in your life? Storms often make me feel powerless. Literally, and more than literally here, just this last week when it blew off the top of one of our trees and the tree landed just missing our roof, thankfully. But then we were out of power for, it was like 6-7 hours, so we literally lost power. But see, storms, like I said, often do that. I think of wintertime as a time I often have felt powerless. Have you ever had that time when you're hitting your brakes in your car and your car just is still going? That moment of powerless of, oh no, I can't do anything. Please stop. And there's just absolutely nothing. If you've never experienced that, just YouTube it. You will see all kinds of great videos, and they're funny because it's not your car. But I remember one of my lessons very early on with what ice and weather can do. I was a confident 16-year-old driver who could drive through anything. I just completed driver's ed, and I drove over ice. So when I was growing up, I lived on one side of the Appalachian Mountains, and our church was on the other side of the mountain. And I remember driving to church, and my dad was in the passenger seat. And he's like, okay, sometimes it would be rain on our side, but when you get to the top of the mountain, it's ice because the temperature changes. And that's what happened. It was a sheet of ice, and then they tried salting it, so it was that kind of slushy stuff at the top of the mountain on the way down. And I'm like, I'm okay. I drove on ice. Of course, the ice I drove on in driver's ed was like a week old that had been melted, and, that's a whole different story than fresh, freezing rain dropping. So I remember going down the mountain, and I remember kind of getting in one of those slides, and I couldn't control it. And then it went into that slushy stuff that you get stuck in, and I kept turning my wheel. And I kept turning my wheel, and the car just kept going straight. And just as my dad was getting ready to say, don't turn it too far, it caught. It shot me sideways. Now I'm sliding down a mountain sideways, covering both lanes of the road as we're heading down a steep, really steep, 15% grade, if you're familiar with all those nice signs with runaway truck ramps and all that stuff. So we're sliding down the thing sideways. I got to get to my dad. He was pretty calm. I mean, if it was me, I'd be like, do this. And he was just kept sitting there, watching me do it. And I just kept turning my wheel, doing everything. Somehow, I got us back going straight before another car came up the mountain and got us, or I didn't end up in a ditch or a tree. I really have no idea. I just was turning the wheel and praying, and somehow it worked out. But I was pretty powerless at that moment. The car was going where it was going at that point, and I just had to hope at some point the tires would reconnect with some pavement, and I would get some sort of control. Have you ever been that type of powerless where something is going out of control that you just don't seem to think you have any control over at all? Where you feel like you're just an observer and you can't make a difference? Sometimes we're in relationships that we seem like we're powerless. The relationship just seems to be spiraling in one direction. We just can't get it back under control and on track. Sometimes our finances seem like we're powerless. There's more and more bills coming in and not more and more checks. Sometimes we feel powerless in our careers. There's people above us making decisions that we have no control over. There's often things in our lives that we are like that skidding car. I tried to find out who said this and I couldn't, so I can't give him credit. But there's a famous preacher who said one of the things that we need to do as Christians today is to repent of Christian pessimism. Christian pessimism. And what Christian pessimism is saying we have no hope in this world except for when Christ returns and everything, and we go to heaven and we're done. This world is so messed up, what's the point of doing anything? And don't we sometimes look at the news and see what's going on in our communities and our world and our nation and everything, and we just kind of throw our hands up like, what can I do? As Christians, we're supposed to be the hope of the world, the love of the world. And it's so easy instead for us to just say, I can't do anything. According to sociologists, it only takes 2% of a population to change it and to make a movement occur. If you think about it, the movement of Christianity started with 12 disciples. It just takes 2% to change a culture. Think about where we could easily be 2%. Think about where you work. Think about the people that you have influence with. And there's other people with similar beliefs where you could have that movement occur. I used to be at the airport on night shifts before I became a supervisor. And night shifts was always known as the fun shift. And it's not just me saying this. I mean, it was like well known. All the new hires would work some mornings, some nights, and everyone requested to be on nights. The reason was, well, the people are cool, the people are better, everyone talks, they hang out, everyone pitches in and helps each other, and everyone that started wanted to work on nights. I left night shift, another guy left night shift, and came to mornings as well. And that was back in September. And just in that short period, we just had 4 new hires started, and they're all like, I hate night shift. They don't talk to each other. They all sit in the corners on their cell phones until the next plane lands. They're like, I do everything on my own. If I need help, I have to make a big point of someone please come here and help me. The whole culture changed. And now the morning shifts become what the night did because just 2 of us moved. 2 out of the whole airport. Because personalities and stuff changed. See, you make a difference with the groups that you are in. It doesn't take, if you've ever been in a group where one person starts complaining and it changes the whole dynamic, it changes the dynamic of everyone having a good time to all of a sudden it's a complaining fest, right? I can up that, this has happened to me, blah, 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 blah. And it just spirals downward. Because we have influence every day with the people that we're around. But yet instead we often think we're powerless and we shrink back. How did Gideon shift from realizing that he was powerless to becoming a person of influence? First of all, if you look, we kind of just flew through it, but if you look at this whole chapter 6, it'd be what we call he was prayed up. I mean, it's constant conversation with God. Verse 12, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said. Verse 13, Gideon replied. Verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said. Verse 15, Gideon replied. Verse 16, the Lord said to him. 17, Gideon replied. We just keep going through that. It's an entire conversation, back and forth. He was having a conversation with God. He was prayed up. God was filling and pouring into his life. And he realized he wasn't as powerless as he thought. And then he stepped up. He actually started taking action. Like I said, here in 7, he calls and says, okay, people, come join me. 32,000 men showed up and said, all right, we're ready to take this on and get our land back. And God said to him, that's too many. They were fighting 325,000 Midianites, and 32,000 was too many. 10-1 odds against you? That's too good. So God says, just make a statement. Anyone who is afraid can go home. Well, 22,000 of them went home. I left them with 10,000. So Gideon's like, okay, this is going to be tough, but we'll do it. And instead, what'd God say? That's too many. So they went to actually a place I've been to in Israel called En Gedi. They went to this spring, and they did this water test to see how they would drink. And there's lots of theories about what this is. If they were drinking like a dog and doing all this stuff, was it they were looking down and they weren't alert? And the people that cupped it and lifted it up, they were alert and watching, so maybe that's why they were chosen. That's one possibility. As they were drinking, they divided them up. Another possibility, like I said, people have all kinds of theories. Some people think that that's how most of them drank, and some people could have chosen, like, I bet you the larger group's going to be picked, so I'm going to drink like them. I could have gone on. I mean, this is all, we really don't know. Like, hey, very few people are doing this, and if I can get out if I do this. But you think most of them would have left them the first group. But regardless, there was this water test of how they drank the water, whether it was about what they did because of being an alert and astute warrior, or whether it was just how God decided it, whatever. They had this water test at the spring. When they were all said and done, only 300 of them drank the water with cupping the hands and bringing it to their mouth. And God said, those are the 300 that are going to fight. Gideon's thinking, okay, 125 against 1. That would be their odds. 125 to 1 underdogs. Now, most people aren't really going to like those odds. And Gideon's thinking, are we really sure about this? So Gideon it says in verse 11, Gideon and Purah went down to the edge of the enemy camp. They go down and they spy out on the Midian camp. And what do they find out? There's a guy that has a dream and someone else is interpreting it. And when he interprets the dreams, he says, if you want the Derrick summary, your dream means that Gideon and his men are going to whoop us. It says, your dream interpretation is we're going to get defeated by those guys. Gideon overhears this, and it gives him a reassurance, a confidence that God is with them, and they're going to be able to win. And so they go into battle with these people. With the 300 men, Gideon divides them up by 3. That's math I learned in college, 100 per group. Tuition well worth it. So he divided them up into 3 groups, and he gave them a torch, a pot, and a ram's horn. Yes, they had a sword as well. But that's how they divided the group up. And so they divided in 3 groups and kind of like surrounded the camp. And they broke the pots, making a big noise. And they all blew their ram's horn. And I will attempt to blow this, but my musical ability is pretty bad. They were a lot better, and imagine 300 of those going off. The Midianites heard the chaos of the pots breaking. They heard the loud noise of all those ram's horns going off. The Midianites started actually attacking each other. They were so scatterbrained of what was going on. They had no clue. They thought they were surrounded by armies well outnumbering them, because what army would attack you with everyone with a ram's horn? Normally that's like the one person in front of the whole division. There's going to be like 20,000 people behind each horn. And so they hear all these horns going off, and they're all just running scared. And through that, the Midianites are defeated. See, Gideon had the influence after all. He felt powerless. He asked God questions. He asked for confirmation. All the things that we would sometimes say, really? Is that okay to really doubt, like keep asking God to give more confirmation? He gives you 2 confirmations, and then you have to go spy on them for more courage and strength? But God said, that's okay. God had the grace enough to say, that's okay, you can still be my mighty hero. As the story wraps up in chapter 8, the great victory, and you want to know what happens? All the people, which is natural, all the people say, Gideon, will you and your sons and your sons' sons be our king? And Gideon takes that moment and he says, no. I didn't win this battle, God did. And that's the third thing. If we're going to have a faith that re-engages, an engaged faith with God rather than being detached, if we're going to be part of the story, we have to remember who the credit goes to. Remember who gets the credit. It's easy when something goes well for us to say, look what I did, or look what we did. And I think God knocked it down to 300 men to say, go ahead and try to take credit. Go ahead and try. 300 against 325,000? I don't think so. No one can take credit for that. That's a God thing. Question is, do we share the story? An engaged faith will share stories with others of what God has done in our lives. Do we share that story, or do we just shy away and share the stories of what God has done in other people's lives? See, that's a lot less powerful. If we share the stories of what other people have done, again, that's detached. If someone hears what has happened in your life, that's powerful. Think about it as something as, man, if someone tells you, man, my friend lost 50 pounds doing this. Okay, that's one thing. All right, I can try that. But if they start telling you, I did this, and you hear their passion, and you hear what's going on, it gets a little more credibility. So if we're going to be part of the story, it's part of God's story, in 2017 here in Champaign County, we need to have an engaged faith. We need to move from that detached faith that is so easy to slip into. Where when God calls us, instead of us thinking it's a calling, we think it's just kind of like cliche. Oh, God's calling me to do something. We move from that feeling of powerlessness to that feeling of, I've got influence. We move from that feeling of, I'm worthless, I'm no one special, I can't do anything, to the new name that God is calling us to be. If we're going to do that, we need to remember our identity. Remember who we are if we're going to become engaged. We need to remember our influence. We need to remember who gets the credit. So what is God calling you to do? Who is God calling you to be? Who are you being called to influence? Your friends, your schoolmates, your coworkers, your family? That's the toughest one, isn't it? To be different around family. What do you need to ask for the strength for, so you're not powerless in facing this obstacle in your life? Where are you this morning? Are you right now fully engaged faith, all cylinders firing, and you're part of the story? Or have you detached a little bit and disengaged and instead telling other people's story? You're sitting in the room and you're watching what's going on, but you're still just kind of observing and checking things out. God's calling us to all be engaged. That's what impresses him. That's what he desires. He wants to be in an intimate relationship with each and every one of us. What do you need to do to move, to be engaged? Let us pray. Lord God, we can so easily slip away. We can so easily just slide back into thinking we can't make a difference. We see all the needs in our community. We see all the needs around us, and it just seems so overwhelming. We seem hopeless, powerless at times. Let's remind ourselves of someone like Gideon that God used that was just a farmer, and he called him out to be a great hero and warrior. Make it clear to each and every one of us what God is calling us to do. Let's re-engage with you and follow your will. I want everyone here to think about, what do you need to do to be part of the story? Do you need to ask God to help you just focus on faith with him? To focus on impressing God rather than others? So you can raise your hand and I'll be praying for you in that area of focusing just on your faith journey and relying on God alone. Maybe you're feeling in that area of powerlessness, of insignificance, and you just need the strength. God can fill that in. Maybe you're struggling with giving God the praises, sharing your stories of what God has done and how he's impacted your life. And then you just need to give God more credit in your daily conversations. Maybe you've never been engaged before. And you're someone that needs to say, I need to make that step of faith, and I need to choose to follow you and become part of the faith journey, make that step towards engaging you and following you with all my strength, all of my faith, all of my being, of taking those steps. Oh God, everyone in this room know where they are. No matter what they're facing, whether it's something in their own, whether it's finances, whether it's family, whether it's friendships, whether it's accomplishing something you're asking them to do, whatever you're speaking to each and every person, wherever you're calling them to be and to go, just give them the assurance that you're with them. Just like you were with Gideon, give them the assurance that you're with them each and every step. To experience your power, your strength in their lives. And we ask this all in your name, Lord. Amen.